Hello, how are you? Welcome to our next discussion in sociological theory. We're going to talk a bit now about Max Weber. And before we begin talking about Weber, I'd like you to do a thought exercise for just a few minutes. If you could, please write down 5 ways in which you rationally calculate your life. And those can be any number of things, but ways that you do some type of rational calculation, maybe in an everyday way. One, for example, would be going to school to get a degree in order to have those credentials and perhaps get a better job. So pick 5 other ones and then come back and start this again. Okay, now that you have those 5, we can talk a little bit about Max Weber and his life and ideas. Weber, as you can tell, was born not after Marx exactly, but Marx was an older man, very older man, when Weber was just developing. You can see he lived 1864 as a birth date, and Marx died in 1883. So in some ways, many theorists have looked at Weber as in a dialogue with Marx, which we'll talk more about. Like Marx, Weber was German, and he came from a Protestant background, religious background, and his mother was a strong Calvinist, and those things are important for understanding Marx's theoretical contributions in the study of capitalism. Again, we'll get to that. His father was a German bourgeois politician. Some people have even called Weber a bourgeois version of Marx. So again, we'll talk more. He studied law and had 1 year of military service, and he married a woman, Marianne Schintinger, who was an early feminist. She also was able to, when Weber died, write a biography of Weber, and it was a strange biography because in it, even though she wrote it, she referred to herself as in the third person. So she'd say, Marianne saw Max and blah blah blah. So, but a very important book to understanding the man. Max Weber taught in the Department of Economics at Heidelberg, even though he's generally claimed as one of the first major sociological theorists. He taught in economics. An important element of his life was in 1897, he suffered a major mental and emotional breakdown where he could not write, teach, even really hold conversations, do some of the most basic things. Before that time, it was noted in some of his biographies, he'd work very, very hard until 1 a.m. in the morning. And so what's interesting is that after the breakdown, it seemed like he reached his most productive period. And in fact, the Protestant ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism, the major work of his that's often cited and remembered, came after that episode. He taught again in 1918, was able to lecture, but unfortunately died 2 years later. As I mentioned a minute ago, Weber came after Marx, and one of the things I like to think about is how ideas originate in dialogues with other people and in relation to the particular historic eras that those people come from. So Weber's coming after Marx. He had the benefit of Marx's theory to be able to critique and add to, augment. So many people believe that his ideas were developed in response to Marx. In fact, that he was in something of a dialogue with Marx. Some people said the ghost of Marx. So something that is important in understanding his theory. One important, difference between him and Marx was Weber believed that sociology ought to be value-free. And that's in stark contrast to Marx, which I have his view written down here, that he basically thought that philosophers have only interpreted the world. The point, however, is to change it. And so Marx is not value neutral. Weber says that in sociology we ought to focus on the empirical, or you can note what is. The empirical means what is, as opposed to the normative, which means what ought to be. So again, a key contrast. Weber says sociology should be about the empirical, the real tangible stuff that you can observe, as opposed to the normative, what ought to be, which was more the orientation of Marx. Now, what did Weber mean by sociology should be value-free? What should sociologists study, focus on? He said their primary focus should be on the meanings that human actors, that people, attach to their actions in some mutual orientation and within a specific social historical context. So it's a lot of fancy words. Let's break it down. The subjective meaning a person has means basically the meaning that something has for them. So one example might be, have you ever had a song that you really enjoyed? You really felt good when you heard that song. Okay, that's your subjective meaning that you make of that particular song. Now, have you ever had the experience where you got sick of that song, that your emotions eventually faded in relation to it? Okay, so there your subjective meaning changed over time. And he wanted to look at what's the meaning that people make of things, especially like actions, behaviors, in some type of mutual orientations in terms of the groups they're part of and in relation to each other, within specific socio-historic contexts. So, for example, why is it that capitalism emerged in a particular socio-historic context? And that was something, again, that he wanted to use as a critique or to augment and refine Marx's ideas. Marx did not consider necessarily why capitalism seemed to flourish in a particular part of Europe that had certain cultural elements. And that's what Marx did not do, and Weber wanted to do, and again, in response to Marx's works. Weber also argued that sociologists need to attempt what he called Verstehen. It's a German word, and it means empathetic understanding. You might, for example, watch someone who chops a log, chops wood. You might have empirical evidence, visual evidence, that says this individual is doing an activity, okay? You've got empirical proof. What you don't have, though, is the motive underlying the action, the understanding from the perspective of that person. So Weber said what we really need to do to accomplish Verstehen is to talk to people and find out their meanings. That person may be chopping wood because they want to have a fire in their house, heat their house. They may be angry and they want to take out some aggression on an inanimate object. They may want to cut up wood in order to carve it later as part of a hobby. So Verstehen is important because, as I have here, this notion goes beyond the empiricism of the natural sciences. In the natural sciences, it's enough to simply look at and observe objects. You don't have to think, why is the rock falling? Human beings do things, though, for reasons. They have motives behind their actions. Sometimes they don't. Like if you hit someone in the knee, you have an automatic reflex. But a lot of the time, they do. And so it's important, if you want to understand humans in a scientific way, to incorporate that idea of meaningful action and what ideas, thoughts underlie the motives. That's what makes humans very different from animals who are, likely to do things based on instinct, for example, in some instances. So you want to get at the subjective meanings that individual actors assign to their actions. Now we get to the exercise that I asked you to do. I asked you to think about the ways in which you might use rational calculations in your life. You came up with 5. I'd be curious what those are, but I want to tell you a little bit about maybe some of mine, And also maybe you can think about how those relate to yours or how you might be able to extend your list. Some rational calculations I make are things like when I eat. I might say to myself, okay, that donut looks pretty attractive. I want to have that. But if I eat that donut, then I have to work out a certain amount, or else I'm going to gain weight. I won't fit into my clothes. I won't like myself as much. So that's a kind of rational calculation. I'm planning for the future, and I'm doing a cost-benefit analysis. And so calorie counting. That's, people don't look at calories on boxes just because they like numbers. I do, obviously, rational calculation in terms of trying to set up goals. In terms of my education, I wanted to earn a PhD in order to get a good job and have a decent status within a community and a decent income. I also do things like make rational calculations on the things I purchase. So, for example, I might say, well, I want to, buy this video game. But if I buy it right now, it's going to cost me a lot of money. Whereas if I wait maybe 6 months, the price will drop. And that's something important when you think about technology, because invariably, if any new technology comes onto the market, it's very expensive. The first people who buy it pay a large price. And then within months, frequently the price goes down. So those are just a few examples of how I do rational calculating in my life. We do it with planners and schedules. I have a planner right here underneath my computer telling me what I need to do when I need to do it. We do it in terms of planning with people and trying to figure out maybe what the most fun is that we can get out of a particular situation with someone. So the extent to which you think rationally, plan, calculate in order to achieve an end is probably pretty strong within your sense of identity. And Weber very much focused on rationalization and rationality as a key element in the thinking process of human beings in the modern era. Again, if you think of the modern era, in the traditional period, we had more belief in faith, religion. The motives that people had were not necessarily for a rational end. Increasingly, people started in the modern era to use rational calculations. Remember the key Enlightenment ideas of reason and rationality, and the notion of progress. We can make things better. So therefore, this logic becomes not only part of the institutions in the modern era, but it becomes part of our individual lives that we take for granted. Weber emphasized three big ideas. I just went through one of them with you. Rationality can be really defined in some ways. It can have many definitions, but a big element is as some type of means-end calculation. How can I get my son to clean his room? Well, if I offer him an incentive, then he might feel inspired to do that for the reward. Okay, means-end calculations, we do this so frequently that probably we don't even think about it as much as we could. The second idea behind rationalization is that bureaucracies themselves are rational in that they're developed in order to achieve some end. And that's something you see all around you. The educational institution, a bureaucracy that works because it's supposed to pass down knowledge and skills from one generation to another. So all kinds of bureaucracies around you function based on rationality. 3, this is a fascinating thing to consider. Rationalization and its pervasiveness in the modern world leads to disenchantment. And disenchantment for Weber meant that in the past we used to have belief in magic or superstition or faith, that the explanations for things were really beyond our comprehension sometimes. And with the modern era, again with reason and rationality and progress, there was a belief that humans could, to some extent, master the world and understand everything eventually. That the majority of your life can be calculated, understood, planned, and would have causal relationships that ultimately could be explained. So we said that the modern era leads to the disenchantment of the world. And in some ways it's maybe a bit sad, but it's an interesting thought when you consider the logic of modernity. Weber also looked at legitimation. How is it that power is institutionalized, and what is the moral grounding behind different forms of power, which we'll talk about next. What are legitimate types of authority? We just talked about legitimation. How is it that someone's authority is seen as legitimate within a structure? One way, and if you think back to the traditional period, you have the traditional basis for authority. So, how it's always been done. And you've heard these appeals probably in many different contexts. The tradition of, for example, manners. Why do we do that? Well, because that's how we function as a society. But traditional type of authority might be, for example, the leader of a church, and that's traditions rooted in faith. Legal, rational, bureaucratic type of authority, or I should say authority within a bureaucracy, is the most prominent type that we see in society today. And that, again, is a big change. We had the logic of maybe tradition and elders being valued for their knowledge in the past. We've moved into a rational mentality, again, privileging certain ways of thinking. And legal rational discourse means that we have laws that are created with universal applications. They're supposed to apply to everyone and allow for a predictability of structure, social structure, and what actions are allowed, how actions are constrained within a society. And also, too, the legal rational is seen as the most efficient way to achieve an end. As an example, if you want to educate the masses of people today, you create institutions in order to do it. It used to be that education was done by parents with their children. But this isn't particularly efficient because you have one parent teaching just a few kids. Now you have teachers that are employed, and they get to specialize in certain areas so that the most effective teaching methods can be done to a larger group of kids on a specialty. And then they go to another person who has their specialty in the larger groups. And you end up in universities where someone like me, a specialist, gets to talk to a lot of different people online about sociology and social theory. So this is supposed to be very, very efficient. I'm sorry, I put the line through way. I meant to underline it. The authority that I have, for example, is based on certain qualifications that I possess. So I am able to claim legitimate authority because of a series of degrees that I went through, which meant that I took a series of classes and exams and completed certain work which was evaluated. That allowed me to become a professor, which again was something I had to increasingly be evaluated for and monitored and assessed on before I was able to get up in the ranks of UNK. So that's a very different logic from people being granted authority because of blood or through nepotism, which might be seen as more traditional. The last type of authority for Weber, charismatic authority, is based on individuals. So, for example, Chairman Mao in China many years ago, Hitler might be an example of a charismatic authority. And like Hitler and like Mao, to some extent this really can't be institutionalized, because if the basis of, for example, a cult is on some particular leader, then when that leader dies, the force that ties people together, the form of leadership that tied them together, is gone. Weber also came up with something that, again, is a bit abstract. The ideal type. This is when you systematically observe general characteristics here of something, and then distill those characteristics down to some essence. And the best way to talk about the notion of ideal type is to look at bureaucracy, one of Weber's big areas of interest. So a bureaucracy, which we've already talked a little about, is another term for a complex, formalized structure. So, for example, forms of government, the military, religious bureaucracies you could have, educational, economic, and all of these different bureaucracies that surround us and we are part of involve a few key things, which I'll discuss next. The ideal type of a bureaucracy is defined by these four things in general terms. First, every bureaucracy that you encounter is going to have a division of labor. And the division of labor means you've got people who do different things and task specialization. So within, for example, UNK, if you get a parking ticket, you don't come to me with the ticket and say, Dr. Borchardt, here's my $50. There's always other people who might deal with that problem that you have, or you have to know who to go to and how they're all interconnected in order to function and to survive and thrive within a bureaucracy. So there's always a division of labor with every bureaucracy that we just talked about. Think about the military, you think about the economy, you think about the Federal Reserve, the people who print the money, etc. Right? With that, you have a hierarchy of authority, a chain of command, and you can certainly think of that within a military, and it's very crucial to maintain that chain of command. In my position, I have a supervisor who is the chair of the department. Suzanne Mon, Dr. Mon's supervisor, is the dean, and the dean's supervisor is the senior vice chancellor of academic affairs, followed by the chancellor. So if you were to, for example, go to the chancellor with a complaint about me, the chancellor might say, well, I'm not the best person to talk to. You need to talk to that person's supervisor. So there's always a hierarchy of authority, a chain of command in any bureaucracy. Third, you see an emphasis on impersonality within bureaucracies. Again, because they're not linked to, for example, nepotism or blood. So you're not evaluated or given some type of credential based on whether you have blue eyes or brown eyes. It's based on technical competence. Right now, you are completing classes in order to pass and be given the credential that you're looking for. Maybe you want to become a physician, and that will mean you had to do certain general studies classes. This might fall into that category, and then those allow you to move further in your education. But the idea is that you earned your degrees. You earned your rank in the military, whatever it might be. And that's an impersonal process. To some extent, you could say education in a large context can be very impersonal. I teach classes of 80 people, sometimes in person, quote unquote, but it's very hard to interact with those people. Often when I give tests, I have to have them fill out their NUID number on the top of a Scantron. So it's run through a computer, it's very impersonal. Finally, bureaucracies are characterized by explicit and most of the time written rules and regulations. So bureaucracies have procedures, they have many forms, usually, and there's a process by which things get done or occur. That allows for predictability, and that, you could say, is part and parcel with rational thinking and the process of rationalization, doing means-end calculations in order to achieve a certain kind of result. And that's really a very useful part of bureaucracies. You pretty much know how things are going to go and what you need to do in order to get whatever type of thing you want. For example, there's a crime that's committed against you, you go to the police, they fill out reports, and that is related to the discourse of law. Someone's broken a law. Then if they find that person, they go through maybe a trial or a process of pleading, and there's a sentence. We don't individually get to decide what the punishment is. This has been granted to a bureaucracy that then deals with that issue in its most rational way. There are, of course, dysfunctions within bureaucracies. And, you know, it's funny to think about bureaucracies because we, perhaps, as it says there, like to take out impersonality, make them impersonal, like to have a clear hierarchy of authority. But in real terms, do these things necessarily exist? I'm sure you've worked in a bureaucracy or had a job where there have been family members who are employed, and to some extent, can you actually get rid of primary groups within a bureaucracy? So there are problems with bureaucracies and how they might not always meet the ideals of Weber's thinking. But also, too, even though you can, for example, predict a calculability of results, for example, like going through your classes, becoming more educated, knowing skills you didn't have before you started, you have the issue of depersonalization. And I just mentioned that to some extent, if I'm teaching a room full of 80 people, I can't individually tailor it. So maybe you've had this experience. Have you ever taken a class where you felt like the way the professor tested in the class did not match up with the types of things that you learned, or it wasn't an effective measure of the types of progress that you were making? In that instance, there's maybe a problem with your individual case, and that's a big difficulty within bureaucracies. It's very difficult to deal with the unusual individual case. Now, here's where things get interesting. Maybe, for example, you've known someone or you yourself have a learning disability. What you would then do is you're a special, different individual case from maybe the majority of the people in the room. You are supposed to go to the Memorial Student Affairs building and talk with a particular part of our bureaucracy, which is designed to work with students who have those disabilities. So the idea that Weber has next, I think, is fascinating. It's called the iron cage of bureaucracy. An iron cage, of course, is something where you're trapped. You can't get out. Weber argued that once bureaucracies are in place, then they are virtually inescapable. If you think about your life, what's the first thing that happens when you're born? There's a document that's created, your birth certificate. What's the last thing that happens at the point in which you die? A death certificate. So your life is bookended by different bureaucratic pieces of paper. And to some extent, in the modern era, we are paper people. You are a series of written records about who you are, what you have done, and you exist within those bureaucracies. To some extent, if you don't exist within those bureaucracies, say, for example, you don't have a social security number, then you don't exist in some real ways. Like, for example, you can't participate in Social Security. You may not be able to get a job. So that's the idea behind the iron cage of bureaucracy. And you could also think of something like getting a parking ticket. Have you ever known anybody who's gotten a ticket and just blown it off? You know, oh, I don't have to deal with that. Well, no, actually you do. Because what's going to happen is the bureaucracy is going to pursue that and find you eventually. And maybe what's a small fine at the beginning will become a larger fine, maybe even arrest. So you can't escape from bureaucracies. They're all around us, and there's something that Weber, called the iron cage. Weber's major works are rooted in a particular question: why is it that modern capitalism initially occurred in a particular part of Western Europe and not in other parts of the world. So Weber wants to argue a bit against Marx and the idea that we humans are defined as having our culture emerge from material life or a base. And this is an argument that you can look at. I'll draw it really badly down here. But for Marx, there was a base, which was material life, and that allowed for the creation of superstructure or culture. So we move from material life, which is the basis for human life for Marx, to a superstructure or cultural developments. Okay? A base to a superstructure, material to culture. Culture develops out of our material existence. For Weber, he wants to critique Marx by saying perhaps the superstructure or culture gave rise to the material life or the base. So he's taking, in effect, an opposite tack in trying to understand why capitalism came about. And that's an interesting theoretical move, and Weber is a very sophisticated thinker. So he is, again, if that drawing helps you, you can add it to your notes. He's trying to ask perhaps what cultural values are affecting social action. Are there cultural values that help explain the development of certain material forms of life? In order to do his argument, he is, pardon me, strange little move there on the computer, he is arguing that there's a particular historical ideal type that emerges, and it's called the Spirit of Capitalism. And he says this Spirit of Capitalism is comprised of four things. First of all, work is valued as an end in itself. Let's think about that. There was once some people who, in like the 1600s, 1700s, I believe it was, they wanted to have their crops collected. It was harvest time. And they hired out laborers in order to do this. The crops were needing to be collected more quickly, harvested. And what they decided to do was they thought to themselves, okay, let's increase the amount of pay that we give people per hour. Because the assumption was, okay, maybe they'll work, say, 4 hours. If they make, say, let's just say dollars. If they make $3 an hour for 4 hours of work, that's $12. These people who needed the work done said, oh, well, we want it done faster. Let's pay them $4 an hour. So they'll work 4 hours and they'll get $16. What they found, though, was that the people who did the work at that time were not really interested in working more. They wanted to work to meet their level of need and what they needed to live. So they worked, instead of 4 hours and getting that done, they worked for 3 hours. So it's funny, because this is a kind of an argument that says, how has work changed over time? When did work become an end in and of itself? Probably you know people whose identity is very much tied in with the type of work that they do, and they love to work. So when did this happen? Weber says it isn't necessarily a natural thing for human beings. This is coming out of culture, a cultural shift. Another element of the spirit of capitalism is that trade and profit are indicators of personal virtue, that we tend to think of people who are successful in business, who have a nice house, who have decent savings, nice objects, who've done well for themselves in their career. We tend to think of them as virtuous, good people, people to be esteemed, right? That's another spirit of capitalism. Another thing today is this idea of a methodologically organized life and governed by reason. Again, you are trying to organize your life to achieve a degree in order to have perhaps a better job or to participate in thinking and more higher forms of culture, to become a cultured person in some respects. And that is seen as, in the spirit of capitalism, to allow for a righteous state of being. People who are successful in those, using those definitions, are seen as virtuous and good and the best people in a community. And what comes with that? One of the big things, delayed gratification, is seen as a virtue. You're embodying that right now again with your education. You're going through a whole series of different exercises and things you need to do and complete in order to get a class completed, to get a certain number of credits completed in an area, to get a degree, etc., etc., etc. So you are a master at delayed gratification, which is also very, very important to what Weber thought was the spirit of capitalism. As I mentioned, Weber's mom was a Protestant, and Weber focused on the Calvinist forms of Protestantism I'll talk about in a sec. In Calvinism, Calvinist theology, you have a certain set of consequences on this spirit of capitalism. So here's the deal. Weber wanted to say that people think capitalism is born out of greed. And you could say that greed has existed in human societies and within individuals since there have been human beings, right? But he says capitalism is different than just greed or the desire to accumulate, to want more, in that it is rational and it's predictable calculations in order to achieve the increase in more. Again, this is a different logic that corresponds with the modern era. So he said, well, what could be the root of transforming this just notion of, okay, I'd like to get more, to something that became more systematic, regular? And what he found was that a particular religious logic promoted ideas corresponding with the spirit of capitalism. The first one, in Calvinist thought, you have a concept of predestination. You do not know, if you're a Calvinist, whether or not you are going to heaven. The phrase is that you may or may not be among the elect, those who are saved, who are going to heaven. You don't know this. And what happens is that can be pretty debilitating if you're an individual. You're saying to yourself, wow, I don't know if I'm going to be saved or things are going to be good for me in the afterlife. And that can be very scary. And Weber said that causes a kind of an inner loneliness and a sense of isolation, fear. And you need to address that, overcome it. How do you do it? What Calvinism promoted was, even though you don't know for sure, in your lifetime, based on your actions, there may be clear signs that you are among the elect or going to heaven. And one of those is you must absolutely think, I am chosen. I know it. And in order to know it, what you do is engage in very intense worldly activities. That helps create a sense of self-confidence, a belief that you're among the elect and you're going to be saved. So Calvinism promotes a kind of a fear, again, which leads people to say maybe anxiety, loneliness. How can I address this? Well, you have to think that you're among the elect and then behave as if you are through intense worldly activities. And that really strongly leads to the fourth point. All believers then are expected to lead methodical, ascetic lives. And what does that mean? That means, again, predictability of action and this idea of saving, not accumulating wealth in order to show off or be like full of status and better than other people. You're not supposed to embody irrational emotions, superstitions, desires. Those things are not indicators of salvation. Okay? So again, Weber's arguing that a particular mindset is giving rise to all of the elements you'll need in order to be a good capitalist. This is something that Marx really didn't focus on. And so Weber is saying, well, here's a critique of this idea. So again, wealth, if you are a good Calvinist, or in many Protestant groups, wealth is automatically accumulated through these types of ideas. If you're a believer, you're automatically accumulating through intense economic activity. You want to engage in capitalist practices to get more to show you're elect. But the deal was, though, that you're getting more, you're profiting, but you can't show it off. So what do? You reinvest, because then you get even more. And then that's further proof that you're among the elect. So accumulation is converted into sound assets. Sound meaning things that will lead to even more profit and more accumulation. So you might be saying to yourself, well, that's all fine and good. Those ideas may have been the impetus for capitalism, but nobody saves money today and reinvests money in order to feel like they're going to heaven necessarily, or very few people would do that. Weber wanted to make it clear that that basis, the cultural basis, had to exist in order for us to get to some of the more, perhaps you could say, greedy forms of capitalism that you see today. So even though that strict nature of those Protestant groups is all but gone in today's society, the impact of those ideas is evident. We see it all around us now, that saving for the sake of saving and accumulating wealth has become an end in and of itself. So again, very important cornerstone to considering why maybe capitalism takes off in a way that was very different from Marx's explanation and ideas about it. Another way that Marx and Weber differed is Weber said, well, perhaps social class is a very important element of life, as Marx said, the economic class that you're part of, but it isn't the only way that humans differentiate themselves from other humans and make meaning of their positions. He said that you can look at both class and status. This is a way of studying social stratification through different patterns of organization. So for example, you can have occupational prestige. You can also have an occupation that has high prestige, but doesn't necessarily pay well. So as an example, teachers are generally held in high regard within a community, but they may not get paid as well as, say, drug dealers. But you see occupational prestige being higher on one set of values and criteria as opposed to something else. So you have stratification beyond simple economic stratification. And that's how Weber added to Marx's ideas about the forms of social inequality. Marx, to some extent, very much wanted to say the history of humanity is the history of class struggles. Weber's saying it's more complicated than that. Class, again, like Marx, you could talk about property or not having property, lack of it, right? That is the basis for economic stratification. Status, as I just mentioned, means we make evaluations of each other in different ways. It can be based on the type of lifestyle you have, whether you have polo shirts with the little man riding the horse, that sets you above others, perhaps. You have particular taste in art, music, something like this. Or perhaps, you are into certain types of music that bring you together with certain other people. So you can have lifestyles, you can have certain forms of education. If you come from a particular family or in a particular occupation, you might have a different kind of prestige than someone who simply has money. Weber also noted party as an organizing principle for social position and the social practice of power. So he didn't just mean party as in political party, but different kinds of groups that you can associate with. So there can be, for example, groups like the NRA. You can also have AARP, American Association of Retired People, collective forms of groups around a certain interest and promoting that interest and wielding a certain amount of power in society and within the presence of other groups. Weber differentiated between authority and power. Authority is the legitimate use of power. Power I like to think of as force. Power means to get somebody to do something that they don't necessarily want to do. So if, say, someone were to walk into a classroom at UNK holding a gun, and that person said, "Listen to what I have to say," that is power. If I were to walk into a classroom, sociology class, and say, "I'm a PhD, I'm a professor here, I have these credentials, and I've been charged with and given a contract for teaching this class," then I have authority. I have the legitimate use of power. And so therefore, authority means that the people who are under that recognize that form of power as legitimate in some way. So differentiate between power and authority. Weber also discussed 4 major types of social action. And even though he typed these, one of the funny things about them is that quite often there are blurry lines, you could say, between them. Or maybe even better said, one type is actually kind of interacting with and part of another. So even though they're differentiated, there's connections between them. Let's go through these types. First, purposeful, goal-oriented rational action. Let's say I want to build a wall in my house, divide rooms. So the goal and the means are rationally chosen. I want to build this wall. I go down to the hardware store, or I should actually say like a builder's warehouse or somewhere. I buy all the material and I figure out how to do that, calculate it, and put it up. So I've got a goal and I've got means that are rationally chosen. So if I told someone, "Hey, I'm going to go build this wall in my house and I'm going to do it this way," somebody might say, "Okay, well, that makes perfect sense because the expectations about how I would behave to achieve that particular end are quote-unquote logical," right? A lot of people can understand it as rational. Second, you can talk about value belief-oriented rational action. Now, let's say that I want to achieve a substantive goal, and it may itself not be rational, but I still want to pursue it. Let's say, for example, I want to have harmony in my family because I believe it leads to a happier home and a better life for everyone. So my values are I value the family. I believe in maintaining a home in a particular way. So I create a wall between 2 rooms in order to give each of my children their own room. And that idea that I want to be a good father isn't necessarily rational, but might still be pursued. So the reasons I might do that are intrinsic more to me. And I might take those actions whether or not they're going to ultimately be successful. So you can see that sometimes people have certain values that they want to uphold. Integrity. And so that means that even if they're not doing purposeful, goal-oriented rational action, they're maybe acting in a particular way, even that might work against their rational interests, because they have integrity, they want to be honest. So that might be more of a belief, value-oriented rational action. Still rational, but it has a set of beliefs that underlie it, like, for example, ethical behavior. Third, Weber believed you could have behavior rooted more in emotion or affect. And this can really be tied again to the emotion or feeling within a person rather than some type of means-ends calculation. So I might do something just because I like someone. I might say, oh man, I want to help you out. Like, for example, if I see someone who's down and out on the street, I might say, wow, I feel like I should give that person money, and I give that person a $5 bill. I don't get anything out of it in terms of rational logic. It may relate to my value and belief system, but also, too, it could just be rooted in emotions or affect. Fourth, you can have what Weber thought of as traditional action, actions that are just sort of customary, and they're relying on the eternal yesterday, meaning that things were good in the past worked and was effective, and we ought to maintain those kinds of traditions through our actions. As I just mentioned, those four types of action, those are usually found in combinations. It would be somewhat hard to say, okay, that someone's engaged in rational actions without perhaps some values underlying them. But Weber created this typology perhaps to figure out maybe more or less why people did certain things. And again, the disenchantment of everything. Perhaps we can explain all human behavior through these different forms. And that's a funny thing to think about. Why do people do what they do? Do they know why they do what they do? But is this important to think about if you're going to study people and social life? So I want to say that Weber is very much aligned with what's called the Interpretive Paradigm, a paradigm that promotes the idea of trying to find out the meaning underlying human action, that we ought to study people using Verstehen, empathetic understanding, talk to people. So methods like, for example, interviews. You could perhaps use surveys, but usually methods that are requiring process and thinking about themes to get at why certain ideas occur within certain socio-historic contexts, as we discussed earlier. And the point of the interpretive paradigm is to try to promote intergroup understanding, to improve relationships between groups and communication between groups, because that's what's key to humanity for those in the interpretive paradigm. Weber believed in modern Western society that behavior was really increasingly dominated by more of a goal-oriented rationality. He said that in previous periods, it was motivated by tradition. You wanted to be like your ancestors. You wanted to fit in with the group. The group had a lot more cohesion rooted around the ways that they did things, and you participated in that as a part of who you were, your identity, very much tied to that clan or group. And when he studied non-Western societies and those types of societies, he was hoping that those would give him a belief, those types of societies would give him a better understanding of how the modern era and its particular characteristics arose. So Weber, again, a very complex thinker and very useful to consider against Marx. Marx falls more under the critical paradigm, which is the idea that social historic periods are important to understand, but the idea is that we study those kinds of human interactions to see how social patterns exist that may be oppressive to some people. Then you've got studies that may involve surveys, things like perhaps interviews and other empirical ways of understanding people in order to promote social change for the betterment of people and to have people become aware of maybe a false consciousness that dominates their life. So Marx's ideas about how we ought to study society, the ways, the reasons for it, the purpose of sociology, and the ultimate goals are aligned with the critical paradigm. Weber is associated with the interpretive paradigm. And those are very different ways of trying to understand the social world. There's a little bit of overlap between them, but I'd like you to know the differences, of course, between Marx and Max Weber.